Hi everyone, I'm Scott from Sharky's Floral and Greenhouses, and today we're talking about African violets. Now, African violets are one of the most popular blooming indoor plants that we have, and it's easy to see why. They're just a very happy plant, and they can really brighten up a room. And they're quite easy to grow and care for if you know these 4 keys to success. So that's what we want to talk about today, are 4 things that you can do to have good success with your African violets. And the first thing I want to talk about is sunlight. Now, African violets cannot handle that bright, direct sunlight. So we can't just put them in the window, on a south-facing window. It's just too much sunlight. What would be preferable is like an east-facing window that gets that morning sun, and that room is really bright and lots of light, but indirect sunlight. So what will happen is on the leaves is they'll get bleached out and they'll kind of burn up. So it has to be indirect sunlight, nice and bright, sunny room, but indirect. So the second thing I want to talk about is watering, and this is really where people mess up on watering their African violets. So there's 2 methods, and both are okay. I prefer one over the other. So the first one I'm going to talk about is watering from the bottom. So I have this African violet sitting in a little tray, and you can water lightly and let it kind of leach up from the bottom. That way you don't get any water on the leaves. So that's one of the things that can really hurt an African violet, is getting anything touching on the leaves or the blooms. They really don't like that, especially they do not like water touching the leaves, and that's where you'll run into trouble. So if you're kind of afraid of that, watering from the bottom is a good method. However, you have to watch that it doesn't get too much water. African violets do not like to be too wet, so not soggy, and they also don't like to be too dry. So the best thing you can do is carefully go through and touch that soil, put your finger in there or use a moisture meter and see how much moisture there is. That soil should not be bone dry. So when it's time to water your African violets, about once a week, and check about midweek too. You want to check and probably water about once a week. So the method that I actually prefer is using a real dainty watering can that has a very narrow tip that I can get right in there. Again, we don't want to be touching the plant. We don't want to be touching or getting water on the leaves. So I can get right in here and water. I'm not going to give it a whole lot because I probably will come back and check a little bit later. Sometimes that water will kind of go through and it'll get absorbed back in. So again, watering about once a week, checking maybe midweek, see if that plant needs any more water. And you probably need to check a little more often in the winter because the air is typically it's so dry and that moisture is so low that the air will just draw that moisture right out of the plant. So you might have to check a few more times in the winter when the air is really dry. Summer's not as bad, but go through, touch the soil, and go through and poke and see if that needs. Don't let it go too dry and not too soggy. Think about what an African violet, in its natural, they don't grow in the ground. They usually grow on like rocks and kind of in moss in undercovered areas that are getting that bright light. So they don't have this deep root system. They have very, very shallow roots, and it's kind of a dainty system. So they don't spread out real far. So you do want to touch that soil and see if it's too dry and not too wet. So right down the middle on watering your African violets. Again, I really like to use the watering from the top. That's for me, that's preferred. So the third thing I want to talk about is fertilizing. Now, African violets are heavy feeders. They do like that nutrient, and our Be Your Neighbor fertilizer is actually perfect for them. So fertilizing about once a month is the preferred. So I go through and I mix up my fertilizer, and about once a month I give my African violets a good drink when I'm watering them. It's just that they have the fertilizer in the mix with them. Our fertilizer is a nice, well-balanced 20, 21, 19 NPK, and that's actually really good for the African violets. They like that bloom, the boosting, and it'll give them the nutrients that they need. You don't necessarily need a specific African violet fertilizer. Our Beat Your Neighbor fertilizer is perfect for African violets. Again, fertilizing them about once a month. And then the fourth key to success is going to be soil. So, like I mentioned before, African violets, they don't grow in the ground. They don't grow in dirt. They don't need a real heavy, thick soil because it'll kind of crush the roots. They have a very delicate root system, and you need a very porous soil. So if you're going to transplant your African violet, you'll need a specific soil. And there's a few out there, and I can list them in this video description where you can find those soils. But an African violet soil is preferred because it's going to be a very porous soil and kind of light and airy. I'm just going to pop this out and show. You can see there's a lot of perlite, the big white hunks in here, because these roots are very small and very dainty, and it's not crushing around the roots. It's real porous. If I shook this, that soil will come apart pretty easily. So with these, we had transplanted these into some pretty ceramic containers. And the first thing we did do is these ceramic containers don't have drainage down here, and I'm not a fan of that, but I know that with these. So I went through and put some peat gravel down just to give it a little barrier. And then we put our African violet in the middle, and then went around with some African violet soil and packed very lightly around it just to get this plant stable and in the middle. And then I'm going to take a piece of this moss out, and it just really dresses up the container. And we put moss around the top, and that just covers the soil. It pretties it up, makes it look nice, but it also will help hold that moisture in. And remember, when you are watering, you will have to maybe move that moss aside and get your finger or your moisture meter down in there and touch that soil, and make sure you're touching the soil to see if it needs a drink or not. So the last thing I do want to talk about is cleaning them up. And on this African violet, there's a few flowers that are spent, and you can just carefully, you don't want to touch much on an African violet because even the oils in your fingers on the leaves, they don't like that. They don't like to be touched too much. So I'm going to carefully, and you could use a scissors if you want, but I'm just going to go through with my fingers. And these flowers are done, so I'm just going to nip this off, get rid of it. So I don't like any organic material falling down and rotting, potentially rotting down below. So it's best just to get rid of them. So any of the spent flowers, I'm just gonna go through carefully, pull those out, maybe just clip them off with my fingers, try to touch as little as I can, and just get rid of that, and just to help clean it up. Now, another little trick that you can do is if your violets are not blooming, and they should be, go through, you can tap them and give them, this little mini earthquake. What happens is they go into this mode of try to reproduce itself, and the natural cycle for reproducing is blooming and then going to seed. And when it thinks that it's in this threat stage, that the little mini tapping and earthquake it will set blooms in a couple months. So you can do that. If your violets are not flowering, you can go through and give them their little mini earthquake and just kind of tap them a little bit, and they will, in a couple months, if you're feeding them, if you're doing all the other things right and they're not blooming, go through, tap them, give them a little wake up call, and try to get them to bloom. So those are the 4 tips, 4 keys to success for African violets. You can find out more. We have lots of tips and tricks on our beatyourneighbor.com website. We have our blog articles, we have how-to videos. You can check out our YouTube channel, and be sure to like and subscribe our videos and share them with your friends. We would love for our information to get out to more people, more gardeners, more friends of yours, and we know that there's people that are looking for this information. So please like our page, our videos, and subscribe to us and share with your friends. Thank you for watching. Have a great day.